All right, but then I got that on there. Again, thanks, Dennis, for sending yours, and Daryl, thank you for sending yours as well.
I don't know if you guys, this is Duncan. I don't know if you guys saw my note with my questions on the presentations with respect to what we should mark them.
I did see that, Duncan. You said, was it public domain, CCO, or CC BY?
Or something else.
Or something else. Now, I mean,
It's something else I'm most worried about. That's why I would prefer them to be marked.
Okay. My thoughts on that is everything's pretty open in this group, unless you guys think differently. It's public domain. Everything in this group is.
That's what the, as long as we agree to that, whoever made them is who has to say what they were. If they're agreeing, they're turning it over to, the sort of normal is you turn it over to Oasis and then it's CC BY and Oasis is the copyright. But you can make it public domain or CC0 if you want. It's just if they were proprietary to somebody, we need to know that. That's why I just want to mark with something so we know they're not proprietary of somebody.
And I agree. It's just put the footer on the slides. I have the same problem with GitHub repos. And it's like, okay, so what is this licensed as,
Well, the GitHub repos, if they're anything to do with anything Oasis, should have a license.
I was just talking in general. It's a pet peeve in general. Pick a license, Anyway, I agree with you. Material should be marked. That way there's no confusion.
Do we have a template deck with the right standard marking for public domain?
Well, no, because this is the working group, so we're sort of allowed to do whatever we feel like, which is why we need to make rules.
Oh, okay. So
it's sometimes easier to just operate under the rules, but if you're not going to have rules, that the rules our working groups don't have rules, then we have to make some.
Well, is there any problem, Duncan, if I post all these out to the GitHub for now? Any problem is in that directory? I'll just say all the documents in this directory are public domain. Is that clear enough?
If you want them to be public domain, again, the sort of default. I mean, I mean, if you're going to be public domain, I'd go CC0 myself, but it's really whoever authors them's decision. But note, OCA doesn't actually allow those particular licenses. It's only two OCA licenses are Adobe, which doesn't make sense because this isn't code, and CC BY. So CC BY is probably what they should end up being if they're going to be output we'll ever use for anything. It's really a check question, but they shouldn't be unmarked.
So what do you think, Dennis? You've authored a lot of these things. What do you think we should? What do you think we should? I mean, I'll just mark the whole directory, whatever we think, because they're all the same. They're all from you. A lot of them are from you.
Yeah, if there's a standard template I should be using that's got the right thingy on it, then I'll definitely do it. But I'm not doing anything that's not public domain that I haven't.
Right. Yeah. Right.
I understand. My take is it's better just to mark the documents themselves with your intent. And then like I got in trouble one time for sharing something that was copyrighted to my corporation, and people will tell you when what you're marking is, but I think it's better just to specifically state your intent.
Oh, as in text, as opposed to some marker.
Just, well, like you said, if we had a template, it'd be in the footer of each one.
Yeah.
But we don't.
Okay. I'll endeavor to do that.
All right. Do you have a preference of CC0 or public domain? I mean, does it matter to you, Dennis, which one it is?
No, and what I worry about only is that there has to be a process to promote it from one to the other. Where's the process? But if I can do something that gets it marked right now as part of the authoring process, that'd be fine. Because these are all intended to simulate discussion. There's nothing here that's proprietary or IP in any way.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the whole intent of these work groups. It's just been open discussions and public information. We haven't even figured out the scope of what we're going to focus on to produce in OCA uniqueness yet.
Yeah. Now I have embedded links in these documents to facilitate you guys getting at the data I'm using to represent sort of the conclusions that I'm coming to. So there's transparency there. But those
that's good, because whatever those people mark their stuff is their problem. So
that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. All right. So then it sounds like you have no preference either way, right? CCO or public domain, doesn't really matter.
Uh, yeah, I wish there was something I could look at that says this one's done with that intent, and so I do it right the first time. And so I'll find something that's marked that way and use that. And what was the designation that it should wind up as from Oasis CC 0?
Well, OCA at the PGB level decides what licenses OCA allows. So Oasis has a long list, and the PGB, for whatever reason, has decided to not use everything on the list, to only use 2 of them, which are CC BY, and basically we only used one of them, which was Adobe, which is really designed for code. Somebody pointed out well, what do you do for non-code? Someone said, oh, we should use CC BY. So they agreed to CC BY. Personally, I think they should have CC0 also, because CC0 basically means, anybody can use it for however they want. You should be allowed to do that, but it isn't currently on the list. So it sort of is a Chet question. You probably should just ask Chet.
Russell, can you check with Chet, or do I need to do that?
Yeah, I could check. What am I asking him, Duncan?
Well, you're gonna ask
What's
him,
the-
is it okay if we use CC0, or do we
Oh,
have to
okay.
use CC BY because that's the only OCA allowed? And probably next PGB meeting, we should bring up that, hey, should we add CC0 to the list too, so that we can do exactly what we're talking about?
I gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I can ask him that question, Dennis. Not a problem. And since as we said, we're not a project, I'm not sure. I don't think we have, to be honest, Duncan, on the PGB side, if we've even defined what a work group could be in PGB terms. I thought that was a discussion, but it never.
True, but that's a separate issue, which is why I'm such a pain
Yes.
in the butt on working groups. But we still have to follow OCA rules. I mean, there's bylaws and everything. The bylaws
Oh, yeah,
basically
certainly,
say everything
certainly.
OCA will follow OCA rules. So just because we're a working project doesn't mean we're absolved from following OCA rules.
Yeah, and I think we are here. It's just a question of how to mark the documents, since, as I said, most of the intent's been public domain for all this stuff.
Okay, now we can go to actually discussing it. Sorry to divert us for so long, but we do have to get it right eventually.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. Dennis, you want to start with your topic, because it's a fresh topic, and then maybe we'll switch over. If you can give a little bit of time, I'd like Darrell to take us through what he's been working on, because I think what he's been working on also relates to some other projects that work groups that he's been also participating in. So I think it's interesting to kind of pull them together.
Yeah, I think I can keep this one to about maybe 15 minutes. I've only got a couple of questions for the groups.
Thank you.
Can you see this?
Yes.
And is it clear enough, or should I make it bigger?
It's okay with me. How about Patrick is always good at critical eye. Is it okay for you, Patrick?
I got the slides up on my big screen, so I'm good.
There you go. So yeah, it's good.
Alrighty, so this is an update expected to be refreshingly concrete compared to all the other updates that we've done. We're proceeding with the idea of looking at what is the open source coverage of the proposed software constellations that are being used in the NCCOE's effort around zero trust compositions of tools to get at sort of that first step of implementation of zero trust using relatively conventional technologies. The intention after this is to make sure that all of our discussions are confined to this working group until we're ready to establish an honest to goodness project and can work under the guidelines associated with it, unless we explicitly acknowledge we're doing otherwise. So the first step of this is to recognize that the NCCOE right now, with about 24 collaborators, that is commercial participants, are putting together constellations of products intended to be that first step of implementation of zero trust architecture using relatively conventional technologies. This isn't the cloud native sort of microservice, linguistic microcomponent, sort of containerized side of the fence. This is, how do I do zero trust using existing portfolio capabilities for relatively conventional application domains. In that domain, the first phase is the crawl phase. How do I get basic capabilities up and running? And there seem to be 5 categories of capability in each of the 8 proposed constellations of products that are the platform for doing this first step at zero trust capability. These categories I reverse engineered out of looking at what are the products that were being proposed in those broad 8 categories. So I just classified them based on very much what you might see in a Gartner Magic Quadrant kind of classification of those things, since they're all commercial products. But what that did extract was what are the functionalities then we need in an open source capability in order to plug into any one or all of these categories, depending on how we constitute a potentially open source based solution to this stuff. And they're what you would expect. Remember the rules on what are the first few steps to go through in implementing zero trust are to discover all your assets, to classify all your assets, to establish a business intended policy and criticality associated with the access that's allowed, and then make sure that you trust nothing, have implicit trust in nothing, and always verify what's going on in that environment. These instrumentations get you at the first cut at that without ever answering the question, where do you express a zero trust policy statement? That thing that says which subjects get access to which objects with what level of criticality. The closest thing to that is category 5, which is the gateway service capability. It's where the first level of market engagement has happened in the zero trust argument, although it rapidly expanded well past that to what happens inside the data center on east-west traffic, all the way back to how do I know about the integrity of the device the user is using and user behavior analysis, all of which are now first-class parts of the zero trust capabilities. But having broken it down into these categories, now we can make some concrete steps on, okay, what constitutes the first category?
Dennis, can I back you up one and ask
Oh,
you a
yeah,
question?
sure.
Previous one?
Uh-huh.
So, and I realize you're just distilling information that's from some other project, so you may not know the answer to this, but reading this, it seems to me there's stuff I can't tell where it goes. Like, it seems that this should cover everything, right? But like, let me just ask specifically. From a OCA parochial viewpoint, where would I find, identity management? Where would I find threat intel? And where would I find things like SBOMs? Are they literally not anywhere on here?
No, they are, but they're cross-cutting. They wind up being things that are infrastructural capability that connects the dots between them. So this wasn't really an architecture or flow layout associated with this. This is the constellation of technologies that will happen in that first phase of practice guides coming from NIST and the NCCOE that say you need these capabilities, and they'll say some things about how they fit together. In every last one of those proposed capabilities, there is a background product that provides identity, but there's not a ton of answered questions about the rest of the environment in which they exist. In fact, they're all being implemented on network virtualized platforms with virtualized servers in order to be able to stand multiple of those solutions up at any one point in time. So identity is definitely part of this. It's going to identify the user. The assumption is that the authentication and behavior and actions directly on behalf of the user happen in the mobile platform side of the fence, but there's certainly an identity service that connects the dots in this stuff. It's just not part of it's part of the platform of the implementation, not part of these 8 permutations that are sitting there. Does that make sense?
All right, so that makes sense for IDM. What about, just picking on one, what about SBOM? So looking at it from the PACE project perspective, and let's say we're focusing on the particular posture of an SBOM. Where is that an asset? So it'd be in category 1, or is that another one of these could be anywhere things?
No, that is one of those things that happens past the crawl phase. So nothing in the crawl phase is addressing the shifted left capabilities. Nothing about provenance, nothing about the security tests or security requirements, and nothing about SBOM bill of materials associated with the artifacts that are being deployed. All of that is to be addressed in one of the follow-on work groups that are going to happen after this first phase.
Okay. Thanks.
It's just how they staged it. So there's a ton of buried context here. These are all valid questions. All I'm trying to do is get very concrete about how do I move this forward one step at a time, assuming we want comparability to those things that are going to get the Good Housekeeping seal of approval in an SP 1800 practice guide from NIST that's going to go straight to the federal supply chain. So if we wanted
And that's why I was asking to see basically where stuff I cared about fit in.
yeah. Oh, and it's going to fit in. It's just this, in this phase, they focused on these constellations of product technologies. So for category one, what I did was ask myself, okay, if I want to discover and classify and potentially look at aspects of compliance, some aspects of compliance of assets in an environment, the category one scope of things in this, what are the open source things that come to mind? This isn't a comprehensive list. This is stream of consciousness based on how much coffee I had in the morning. So if anything is missing from here for discovery, classification, and compliance of assets from this list that you think needs to be there, that is an open source capability that we ought over the next couple of weeks look at for how well does it cover that section of this, the NCCOE proposed constellation of capabilities, then let me know. If there's anything you see here that looks like an obvious outlier that you would never use, then that's another thing. What we're trying to do is get to a level of open source coverage. Doesn't have to be exhaustive, but I know I don't have everything that you guys will have in your perspective on the list. What I try to do is get some representation from network-based discovery and characterization, fingerprinting, and that sort of thing. A little bit deeper into maybe discovering both services and level of vulnerability, maybe being able to express security requirements a la Vulkan as a mechanism for getting STIGs into inspec execution in an environment, more generic capability in terms of OS query, and then maybe some level of putting the compliance into a broader perspective, looking at the FSMA capabilities, the stuff that's automated. The links are here so that you can drive to what I used at least in initially looking at this stuff. So the question up to you guys over the next week or so is there anything on this list that, or anything that needs to be added to the list that's an obvious thing? You can send that to me in email. You can speak now or suggest it at any point, however you want to do it. Or are there any obvious solutions? Go ahead.
Is it possible, and if this is too much overhead, then don't do it now, but I would say before, at some point, we're going to have too much of this to keep track of in view graph form, basically. This seems the type of list that does seem to me to be more amenable to a GitHub repo with a, markdown file in it that just has a list in it, and then someone wants to add something to it, they do a pull request against the list or whatever. And then we have change control on, because I assume this list, once we decide, if we decide on this list within the next week or two, I assume that does not mean it's cast in concrete forever. So I don't know at the rut point to get a little more rigorous, but it seems too loosey-goosey. By the time we get to submitting anything across the wall to NIST, I think we need to be, something like we have a list and a markdown or something, as opposed to, I have to remember it's in slide 7 of the view graph from the meeting notes of whatever.
Makes complete sense. This list is intended just for my working list to do the analysis. That is what I'll do with each of these now, is figure out what level of coverage does it provide against the comparable capabilities of the constellation. And then once we have that, some of these will have relatively complete coverage, some may have almost none. But I needed the list of what do I have to look at, drive into in terms of things like identifiers and how they might be connected, that kind of thing, if that makes sense. So what I'm looking for, I guess, is anything I obviously missed or anything that that doesn't make any sense from this group's perspective. The results, the list with its positioning with respect to its level of coverage or maybe what it covers as part of one of those constellations, but all open sourced. Open source based should be, as you suggested, work product that's taxonomized and that's marked in. What do we use, by the way, in terms of representation there? Straight up sort of HTML, or are we using a particular domain language for describing the document?
If you ask me, I prefer Markdown just because it's easier for non-expert people to, edit and change.
Got it.
But pretty much most groups operate under the whatever volunteer runs it gets to, since they're doing all the work, they get the most say.
That sounds reasonable.
Guy with the bushes on his hand gets to pick the shovel.
I think that's fair.
I think Markdown seems to be a reasonable approach, since it integrates into things like polls and everything. I like what the OpenC2 folks have said or have done with their documentation. Of course, I realize some of them are on this call, but
Do we have a GitHub locus for the Zero Trust Working Group artifacts?
Yeah, we
It was
have stuff-
agreed by the PGB, you'd get one 5 weeks ago.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, the PGB, the OCA process of doing anything websites and GitHub's is months long, not weeks. Unfortunately.
Chet told me this morning he'd work on it today and tomorrow.
Oh, really? That's great news.
Well, it's
Okay.
because I blew up at the last PGB meeting.
Yeah, I mean, the website's been due for 9 months. It's incredible. But we have a current GitHub out there that I've been using. I mean, we're going to move from it. But the point is we could transfer it for whenever Chet does his work, we could take it from wherever it is now to wherever he's putting it if you want to do it earlier. Right?
True, but the one we're using is a blatant violation, which is what prompted all the stink in the first place. So really, yeah. Use it until he gives us a new one, but hopefully.
That's exactly what I'm doing. It's just a parking lot. You're absolutely right. It's all I'm using is parking lot. If you want to go ahead and do it to Markdown, we could put it out there for now. And as I said, we could transfer it over as soon as Chet's done. That's easy.
Okay, well, these two questions are open and we'll keep them open through the next couple of weeks as I'll do the analysis and try to summarize the degree of coverage provided by each of these tools. And if they need to fit together to cover the category, how that might happen. So just keep in mind the questions and I'll be open.
So the only question I had on this list, Dennis, is if PACE fit in. I mean, it's kind of related a little bit to SCAP, isn't it? Is if PACE would fit in here somehow, because it is kind of discovering things.
Well, I was going to bring it up, but we don't actually have our open source there yet.
No, I understood, but maybe we just put it as a little star when it gets there.
Yeah,
I was tempted to bring it up, and then I was going to say, oh yeah, and then they're going to say, but we have nothing to point to. But
No, I know, but it just seems like the right thing to do.
I'm all for it. If you're willing to put it there, if you're willing to put vaporware there, I'm all for it. Because
Yeah, just
by
like
the
start.
time you
Just
get to
something
using
to
it, we might have something there.
Yeah, exactly. So just put it as a star or something that's emerging, emerging relevance, because I think but plus it has the adjacency of being in the OCA, right? So that's also cool.
so I'll put a marker for it now just so I don't
Yeah,
forget.
just a little marker. I mean, Junkin's right, but I think its potential is to help here.
Oops.
Just emerging. If that's okay with you guys.
I threw the repo in the chat just so you could know where it was.
Thanks.
I just noticed something here with an att.com suffix on it.
You would notice that, Patrick. Yes.
Well, I should have noticed it. Doesn't say much. Anyway,
So that's all I had for this for now. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dennis.
So one more just question on that list, and I realize we're constrained by sort of how NIST set everything up and only in the crawl phase and all that. But is there any way to argue stick shifter or Kestrel into this initial work?
For this category, that'd probably be tough. However, when it comes time to describing how you put the tools together, NIST will do this in a practice guide. They'll say how to take that constellation of technologies and combine them to make up something. And in doing so, they'll be leveraging parts of platforms like Active Directory and stuff like that. So it's certainly possible to say, I'm connecting the XDR, NDR kind of capability through a stick shifter intermediate abstraction so that you've normalized that interaction, if you will. So certainly for the things that sticks can pay attention to, that certainly makes a ton of sense. And in the same domain, there are probably other such abstractions that keep you from saying just this constellation of products tightly coupled is how you would do this in open source, but instead you might have a number of the standardized abstractions that let you do this more generally and more malleably, if that makes sense. So you certainly could could make that part of the capability. There's nothing that prohibits it as long as you cover the functionality.
Yeah, I'm just trying to more get our oar in the water for what we do best sooner. Because obviously the commercial companies are all going to argue for what they do best. And again, you pay for it, you're going to get more. So they're going to do certain things well. And all said and done, they stack the deck on how to do this. So I'm trying to figure out how to unstack it to our favor. But if we can do it, great. If we can't, that's okay too.
I don't think it complicates anything, especially because of the indicator exchange nature of sticks. It gives you that nice clean interface to the ecosystem, a mechanism that frankly is only addressed in the NIST commercial offerings by the subscription services. They don't recognize sort of the cooperating community that comes together to make this stuff work on an ongoing basis. So it may be a great way to broaden the scope of things by virtue of having the hooks to do so.
Well, what do you think, Dennis? And zero trust to me is just a massive challenge, I think, here. And I was just thinking, NIST is going to need to think about how they're going to bring together not only the multiple products in the single domain, which is the crawl part, but the multiple silos of identity, data, and access. I mean, I don't see without some kind of model that they could figure out the perspective of zero trust posture across 3 different domains with a million different implementations by vendor. I think NIST is going to be forced to do something, don't you?
That probably is true. I think there is it's no mistake they started with the simple, very cloud friendly-ish implementations at the outset. That the NCCOE stuff is beginning to get into the much gnarlier area. But the argument they're making is that zero trust is intended only to move the ball forward on supply chain resilience, and it's doing so by giving you the hooks for hooking in the shifted left stuff, both testing and curation of the parts that go into the pipeline, and then separately granular confinement so that what gets past those 2 screens has a level of containment associated with it in limiting the blast radius, and then insisting that the boundaries of all those compartmentalized chunks, those cellularized and that cellularized environment, are least privilege and least capability. That is the big picture argument that a zero trust capability actually moves the ball forward against a supply chain vulnerability in ways that are material. But it doesn't answer all the rest of the questions about security or all the rest of the questions about how do you sustain such a policy structure and where do you express the policies associated with it. So there are some unanswered questions, no doubt. They're going to have to get answered. But the application of zero trust to things like cloud native architectures and use on cloud platforms has become as simple as invoking a reference architecture and using that as the framework in which you do the insertion of applications into a cloud environment. Amazon and Microsoft and Red Hat and Google all have reference architectures into which you can insert this stuff that seem to be conformant to those objectives without answering the question of where do I put a zero trust policy statement and what engine interprets it.
Yeah, no, I got you. That's certainly a pragmatic approach. I just think if you map that to the real world environment that people run, you've only hit a subset of it. So what good is that?
Well, and that I think stimulated CISA's observation in the maturity model document that this is going to take years to do the first zero trust for conventional applications using conventional architecture, because lots has to get done that isn't done yet.
That is, and it's not in the domain of what you just described. But I understand the pragmatism of what they're doing, and I completely can see why you would do it that way. But I just think you map it into a real world IT environment out there that's not going to cover it. I mean, it's not.
So the near-term opportunity is that NIST is going to be issuing these practice guides, these SP 1800 guides, that are the baby steps in the direction of zero trust that everybody's going to be able to point to and use. We want open source capabilities to actually be evaluated for exactly that capability as well.
Exactly. Okay, gotcha. I'm on the same page now. Gotcha.
All right, I'm done. over to, who's up next? Daryl?
Daryl.
There's too much enthusiasm when you said my name.
Well, I was trying to introduce you. It's your first
Yeah.
time up there, you know.
I'm gonna have performance issues, guys. Hang on. Let's go. Are you hosting? Are you putting it on there?
No, you can go ahead and take the screen.
Well, I don't have my, I'm on WebEx on another device.
What do you got, a phone? What the hell are you doing over there? Hold on. Okay,
Yeah,
I
I've got a phone, an iPad, and a Mac. Hey, don't blame me.
You're resource rich, are you? Okay, gotcha.
I'm
I
not
got you.
exactly resource rich. I didn't realize I was so in demand until
You are.
salespeople
are.
started asking me for help.
You are.
You got a phone and an iPad. What more do you need?
I know,
Yeah.
right? I need less.
Yeah.
I need less. I don't need more. I don't need more. I need somebody to shut the internet down for about a week so I can mentally recover.
Could put you in a certain country that's internet's going down.
Yeah, right. I know, right? Unless I get Starlink, I'm out of trouble. Yeah.
So can you see Daryl's presentation? I think I shared it right.
So this is really a rough draft, guys, to get feedback from you all, and I'm going to provide a more detailed version. I'm reluctant to do it because I've been getting so much input from two other working groups I'm on. One is the ontology working group that's tied to this, and then the other one is the IOB working group, which is the indicator of behavior. And there's a lot of, I guess, common strings that are tied between them because I'll give you an example. If you want to go to the next slide 2, this is obviously you've seen this NCCOE diagram for zero trust architecture and then the core components. The CDM aspects I know this is largely influenced by the Fed. I'm not a big fan of the CDM strategy. I think it's been a large unintentional misdirection, waste of time trying to get everybody on a standard view across agencies and sub-agencies. The supporting components on the policy side and the SIM, the component pieces, the enterprise resources, all of these things have taken their direction largely from a security discipline perspective, but there hasn't been a lot of discussion, for instance, around how the end user or the key stakeholders think about risk, and then subsequently how we communicate that back to them, both not necessarily from a practice standpoint because they're not going to get all the detail from an analyst. So I just wanted to point out the architecture doesn't speak to that component, but we're hoping, obviously, in the ontology work group to address some of that. If you go to the next slide, this is just some execution barriers we should be talking about around zero trust because whoever said zero trust isn't really clear. I think I agree completely. I think that it's, for lack of a better term, it's a little bit better than just trying to follow comprehensiveness standards because that's just not plausible for these reasons. With the market as it is today, and then the way analysts are working, they face all of these execution barriers, right? And at different ones are impacting different individuals and organizations, relatively. The Fed doesn't have as much of a problem with budget, obviously. They do have a staff competency problem as a standard. Burnout's a big problem. So I think considering these things and categorizing them in terms of how they're addressed by Zero Trust in terms of our work group would help to drive a practical output as to which of these we're dealing with in our work group, with regard to our explanations and order priority. If you go to the next slide. This is a really nice little diagram I found online that helps with the understanding of just optimal prioritization of tech. It was meant for SIM, and I think that it really helps with regard to understanding how do you where do you get the maximum value, right? And if you look in the top right, And I had them out of order. I apologize. Green should have been after, blue should have been after green. But if you look at the high volume, high queries, both metrics maximize. That's ideally where, and query meaning an actual search or rule alert that's set up in a sim world. But from a technology standpoint, we could use these terms like queries interchangeably for in a zero trust architecture for a very dynamic yet secure output as it relates to what zero trust architecture is going to apply, and give some metric for implementers and users on the security side to determine how do they measure success at a granular architectural level, tool by tool, process by process. And if you'll go to the next slide, this is really, I wanted to summarize what we're doing in the other groups without inundating everybody in this group with the detail. But if you look at this, if you put it in the PowerPoint presentation mode, please. Yeah. So I'm trying to incorporate both in this group and the other two work groups the importance of business model and value chain, fundamentally for applying business taxonomy or some type of workflow process taxonomy above the IT service layer, so that we can understand how does the business speak, so we can find some tautological common language, how to say the same thing a different way is all what tautology is, or unless you want to look at it from a logic perspective, something that's obviously true. But we need to have some common terms that string together what we're doing from an execution standpoint, applying zero trust to security services and solutions back to business workflow. And I don't know that the term business before workflow is ideal, but an upstream workflow that's utilizing IT services, right? And so the supply chain is really where it helps understand what's coming in as an input into that model, and then what's the expected output is how you measure it with the value chain, if that makes sense. And that below that, I guess you're all familiar with a business value analysis. That's essentially the standard diagram for business value analysis in the bottom left. If you're not familiar with it, it's really around margin output, and pub-fed models, it doesn't apply from a margin standpoint. That would be a service output, and then service level, quality of service level, right? Whatever KPI or metric they're using to apply that. Do you guys have any questions about those at all? The NCCOE piece is right there to the right. The bigger question is to the bottom right, which is the tautology between how we speak, how we work and how we speak, and then how that affects, or the relevance of that to business architecture.
Well, one comment I have, and I've been through this before. I used to work on a product where we actually secured business systems, just using that term that you're using. And one of the first problems you have is what comprises a business system. And in today's world, it's even worse. So that arrow you have, the business architecture driver, I mean, I'm interested in that domain, because if you distill it down to like you and I, right? I'm a user and I have access to, IBM's applications, but it depends on where I am and what network I'm using, right? So how does that get distilled so you can define it, so that you can understand the visibility control of my access to important information that needs to be protected via zero trust policies? Without that visibility, you're not protecting it, obviously. So, that part of me, to me is I don't know if you have any suggestions, but that how you get that business architecture distilling down to the info architecture, I think is a very key, interesting discussion to figure out how's that going to work in a zero trust world where, as I said, I've been working on applications at IBM. Some of them are mainframe based, some of them are on distributed systems.
Right.
Sometimes I'm in the coffee shop on a non-VPN network, and sometimes I'm in my office on a secure network.
But
Those all make a difference.
All said and done, Russ, I mean, oversimplifying, none of those are zero trust networks. You're
No, but
basically
you could-
saying, how do you add the extra layers of a layered defense in? And zero trust is supposed to be, you don't trust that they're there, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, I'm more looking at this top picture with the zero trust architecture, right? Is that, as you look at it from the user device point of view, you kind of have to know what I just discussed in order for you to figure out what policy and enforcement you're going to do against me.
And then how you're going to enforce that policy from a technical
Yeah.
standpoint, from a security architecture. That's where
Yeah.
you have a multi-plane model with that we're going to have to figure out, like the language is going to have to complement but clarify what we're doing from an
Right.
execution perspective all the way upstream,
Yep.
so that we have consistency. This doesn't change what we do from a discipline standpoint in terms of execution on a day-to-day basis about how we do, prioritization or attribution. It doesn't change any of that, but how we communicate that upstream, both to IT service and then to the business. The dilemma that we're going to run into, this is where we're like the redheaded stepchild of all of all business models. The dilemma we're going to run into and have run into already from a discipline standpoint, both from formal certification, education, all of it, is that we can talk to IT service somewhat well, but IT service doesn't even understand the language we talk. And then above them is the business, who doesn't really want to hear from IT service about how the sausage is made.
Yeah,
And
but you could bridge that gap. We
we
did that through
can bridge
we
it.
did that through services, right? I mean, you
That's
approach
right.
it from a yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We can do that from understanding service delivery.
Yeah, that's right.
Service delivery ties ties up to execution, like the business execution.
Yeah.
And the beauty of what security sort of has a unique opportunity to do is elevate its importance up to the business and bypass IT service
Mm-hmm.
and jump ahead by using risk related language that's tied to outcomes.
Well, yeah,
And
certainly
because
yeah.
right, because the business today talks in terms of using, I know I remember this obviously from my massively parallel processing days around BIBA and all the stuff that research groups use, as well as businesses on a daily basis. They talk in terms of numbers, but the numbers reflect some output tied to margin, tied to service, all of these different metrics that roll up. And that's sort of the hard thing that's happening on the ontology side. They're stuck, and so I'd suggested that they use two categories: threats and vulnerabilities, because that's at least somewhat neutral in terms of nomenclature to talk to the business, because everyone can understand what a threat is: something that's trying to harm you, and a vulnerability where they might focus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if we can categorize threats and vulnerabilities and then prioritize services by functional area first in a business or in a model, if we can do that, then it gets simpler in terms of understanding these things fit into that category for finance. And here are the services that finance consumes from an IT standpoint. And here's how we secure, execute policy enforcement to those services from a security perspective.
Right. Is there any relevant reference ontologies for business architecture to that driving info architecture part?
Not that are effective. My
Okay.
days at Gartner were very telling, because they have a knowledge database that has basically all of the IT service purchase history, diagrams, everything. And I remember, if you guys remember, EAs, enterprise architects, were supposedly going to be the diplomats
Yep.
between all of the business and IT functions to explain value upstream, and then communicate business execution necessity or priority downstream. And it never succeeded. And in another morphology. It was called master data managers, which was more closely akin to, if you're a discrete manufacturing company or it's a fixed product or service that's quantifiable, that made more sense. But even then, that never took off. It lasted for about 5 years, and there used to be work groups that were in major cities, and it disappeared, and it only lives today in its protected habitat of physical supply chains. And so this is a unique situation. If we leverage the zero trust framework and try to apply, create some tautologies, to help communicate back to the business. So I don't have a lot of answers. I'm observing a lot of problems that don't go away unless we have a different strategy of communicating what we're doing upstream. Does that make sense? Or does anybody have any input or observations that could help untangle some things in my brain?
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. There is a significant amount of information architecture around connecting the dots, as you started to do here, between the supply chain, the zero trust runtime policy enforcement architecture, and what you have below it in the lower right quadrant, sort of the mapping between business importance and criticality and the underlying relationship to the information systems, and at the bottom, the assets that are associated with it. That normally, though, is faced in the federal space with things like crown jewels analysis,
Right.
critical infrastructure space, maybe the risk map kind of modeling, Jim Waters stuff out of MITRE, that kind of thing. But they take the same idea, that is, to address risk at the asset level, you need to know the impact risk, the business sort of so what factor of the service it's supporting through the relationships that are the
That's right.
infrastructure that's there. So I think this is spot on. I've got some slides that I've been working through, trying to go at the same thing that I'd love to talk through with you, and maybe I can at least help contribute to the way I look at exactly the same observations
That'd
that
be
are coming
great.
out of the slide.
That
I think there's some opportunities there.
Yeah, that would be great. I need some other stimulus or input from, just so that I can start to figure out how. I mean, I already know how to logically organize these things, but I'm trying to figure out what do I use.
Yeah. What can we leverage versus have to invent?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Inventing is so hard. Inventing is just so hard without pure legislation out there driving behavior. Right. We're trying to come up. We're literally trying to tease them into talking the way that we think makes the most logical sense.
Yeah.
And they understand business risk, but all the academic research out there has basically made them benign, because they've been viewing risk as basically, from a cyber standpoint, for the past 15 years at least, maybe longer, they viewed it as something that, fire hazard insurance, cataclysm.
Right. Yeah.
They
Oh, that's a
haven't
risk.
right. They haven't viewed it as, I mean, this is not a cataclysm. This is an ongoing war to everyone that has any digital dependencies. I mean, they are not going to escape the significant amount of risk they're exposed to. And so we have to figure out a way to communicate this back through ZT, and that will also elevate our position, or from a ZT standpoint, in bringing value back to the market in terms of clearing up a lot of this muddy water it's really been muddied by, not peeing on IBM's parade, but it's really been muddied by product providers,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
All of them building walled gardens they want to defend.
that's
Yeah, absolutely.
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We know that. We know that's true.
Yeah, that's right. And the reality is, it's like, or every business is an open house 24/7.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I would really appreciate that.
So, Daryl, if you can pick some time that's available, half hour, whatever you can, and ping me, and we can talk through it, and I'm sure
Okay.
we can make some headway.
Perfect. Thank you.
The only other approach I can recommend that's worked for me in previous things like this is to at least just start thinking about visibility. They don't know what they don't know. You're talking about that, the issue of the risk and the associated with it. So is there some way we can kind of point out, here's your garden, here's what's growing in it. And that way, when we take a look at the overall look at it, you'll find you got more weeds than flowers and that kind of stuff. And so
I think
sometimes,
that's, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's the reason we've gotta associate efficacy with this stuff. We've got to be
Yes,
able
yeah,
to look at real business impact risk
right.
and what the effort and technology and process does to address that. But that means not looking at sort of implementations and alert rates. It's
Right.
much more sort of what's my resilience level as a result. It's something that the market has avoided asking and answering in all of the massive amount of investment and innovation that's gone into security to this point. We treated it as a market rather than as a problem to solve.
Mm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've treated it as another market segment, and Gartner, IDC, Forrester, all of them have, and they've all, Cleveland, all of the research companies that are supposed to be setting some kind of a common standard, they've actually failed miserably and fed the noise. And
I got things to sell too.
right, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly their mentality, and they're supposed to be clearing up and helping people prioritize, but they're actually just reporting the news to everyone after the fact, and that's where, from a security standpoint, tying it back to risk would elevate our position to the business,
Makes sense.
and
Yeah.
and we would leapfrog past IT, who really, IT, for lack of a better term, the business still doesn't agree that IT adds value. It's hilarious to me that, but then they'll complain, right? And I don't want to turn this into a soapbox session, but it's an observation that we can take, where we can observe the failures of other disciplines that have supported the business, leverage those failures if we can carefully understand where they fell apart, and overcome it.
Yeah, we used to have a saying: "Is business running IT? Is IT running the business?"
Yeah, that's, I mean, don't say that out loud in a board meeting, but right.
No, it's a struggle. I mean, it's a constant battle. I mean, sometimes the IT groups do need to drive because the technology is such, but there's other cases where the business needs to be focused, and you can see variations, but it's never all of one or the other.
No, that's exactly, well, the irony is, it's I'm sort of interesting that Malcolm Gladwell has, he doesn't have any technical competencies per se in security. Otherwise, he would have already written a book and
Yes.
follow up to Tipping Point, and just saying that, I tell clients that, there's the 5 and 95%, and the 5%, was 60, 70 years ago, when people thought there was very little dependency on technology for automation from a digital perspective, and most everything was analog. You fast forward to today, and it's 95% or greater in terms of dependencies. Um, but more significantly, behavior is that we're not going to secure. We've already let the proverbial cat out of the bag, or the left the lid off of Pandora's box, and somebody burned it in a fire pit somewhere, because human behavior is driving the largest significant amount of, from a vulnerability landscape surface area, and then they're asking the smallest function within the business to then secure the rest of the business. It's just it's job security for everyone, but it's also, it could lead to a lot of therapy and medication.
So, well, it's a very challenging problem.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so should I continue to have you on the agenda to have this topic discussed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
Okay.
think so, because I think
Okay.
I'll bring back to everyone here what's happening in
Okay.
the ontology work group,
Great.
and what's happening in the IOB side.
Super.
Yeah.
Because I do like the fact that you got them all correlated together and you work on them all. I think that's awesome. So.
Yeah, you guys are helping them as well, from my input to them, because it all ties back. Everybody's focused on zero trust. It's not going to go away for the next 3 years, depending on what other shiny object pops up.
That's
Who
right.
knows? If they can come up with a different mathematical term besides zero, they will. Sub-zero architecture or something. Who knows?
Okay, excellent. Well, we've come to the top of the hour. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. And I'll post this stuff out.
Thank you all.
Good day.
Happy Monday again.
Happy Monday.
And by the way, I think I've got the answer. MLAI Trust.
I like it.
But of course.